And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis showing some thin and not too concentrated ice down around St. Paul Island there, with the heavier pack ice off to the northeast about 20 nautical miles or so, give or take there. But it's not going to last long with those southerly winds coming in for the upcoming next few days. It's going to blow that back to the north. And here's the first storm that's doing just that here, pushing in today, bringing the strong winds and warmer temperatures into the Pribilof Islands, with rain and gusty winds in the Alaska Peninsula, cold basing gusts 55 miles an hour. And for tonight, that'll continue as well. And snow and blowing snow spreading northward from the Kuskokwim Delta across the Yukon Delta and crossing Norton Sound into the Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island. Much lighter winds and drier conditions over the central and eastern part of the state. And not too bad for the southeast coast. Even better tomorrow with a lot of sunshine breaking out there. Mostly sunny with areas of clouds, central eastern interior. On the west side, gusty south winds, mixed precipitation. Mostly rain though for the Alaska Peninsula, the eastern Aleutians. Snow blowing snow, St. Lawrence Island. And that area extending up into the northwest coast there, maybe the Noatak Valley areas. And then for Wednesday, that front weekends here hangs up along the coast due to strong high pressure over the interior, keeping it mostly sunny. Next system spreading more wind and rain, mostly rain to start there for the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutian areas, but that'll track right on up into the Bering Sea on Thursday night and into Friday. And for the coastal water forecast here, north winds 15 knots for the south coast. Central coast, north to northeast winds at 10 knots and northwest at 10. So pretty light there along the coastline. North coast seas about 5 to 6 feet. North winds 20 knots, central and northern inner channels of the Panhandle. And for Clarence Strait, northwest at 15 knots. And for Wednesday on the south coast here, northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. Central coast, northeast at 15. And northwest to northeast winds at 15 knots for the north coast. Increasing winds here for Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, and Stevens Passage. Small craft advisories, in fact, for north winds 25 to 30 knots in those areas, and north 15 for Clarence Strait. Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast, Barren Islands, tomorrow looking light and variable at 10 knots. And for Cook Inlet, north winds 10 to 20 knots, east winds 20 knots for Kamishak Bay. And for Wednesday, Cook Inlet, variable to north winds 10 to 15 knots, light winds for Kamishak Bay, westerlies 15 for the Barren Islands, North Gulf Coast, west to northwest winds at 20 knots, light variable winds continue for Prince William Sound at 10 knots. Kodiak Island, east-southeasterlies tomorrow at 20 knots, gale warnings for Bristol Bay, southeast winds 40 knots in the Alaska Peninsula. Pretty windy conditions continue tomorrow with southeast winds of 40 to 45 knots. A little bit lighter on Wednesday with south to southeast winds 15 to 30 knots there for the peninsula. Bristol Bay southeast at 20. Kodiak Island south to southwest 15 knots. Eastern Aleutians, specifically on Alaska Island, you'll see the gales southeast 45 knots, west 25 to 30 knots for Adak and Atka. And the western Aleutians, northeast to east winds at 20 to 25 knots. And for Wednesday, western Aleutians here, Kiska to Shimia, northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. Adak and Atka, southeast winds 30 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, Nikolsky over to Unalaska, Dutch Harbor and those areas, south to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the southwest coast here, gale warnings. The highest gale south of Nunivak Island, southeast 45 knots there. Nunivak Island, St. Lawrence Island, southeast at 35 knots, east 25 for Norton Sound. And southeast winds 45 knots, St. Matthew Island, and about 40 knots for the Pribilofs with seas up to 17 feet. And south 35 knots for St. Paul and St. George on Wednesday, as well as St. Matthew Island with small craft advisories or brisk wind advisories along the southwest coast here, 25 to 30 knots from the southeast, and 25 to 30 knot winds also for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound with a southerly direction. And for the eastern Boulevard Sea coast tomorrow, light east winds at about 10 knots, 15 knots on the central coast, 20 knots on the western coast, and the Chukchi Sea east winds at 30 knots. And then for the day on Wednesday, increasing winds here. Gale warnings coming into the Chukchi Sea for south to southeast winds, 35 to as high as 40 knots. And now brisk wind advisories for the Arctic coast out of the southeast on the west side, central and eastern Baltic Sea coast, east winds 25 to 30 knots.